The smartest guys around are about to break it down like they've won.
So have you been?
Good. How are you?
Good. You know.
You ready for this today?
Yeah, I got a lot to say. This is a meaningful episode for me. Really?
At all?
How about you? You're. I'm surprised the well never runs dry for you.
Look, do you realize what else I'd be doing if I didn't have this?
No, I just mean you give and you give and you give. You know?
I'm glad somebody finally noticed.
Which is like just have to saying new and interesting things every night.
Yes, that's right. Look, it's time for a podcast, and here we are back again, the Survivor Know-It-Alls, and here's a guy that never would break his word. It's Stephen Fishbach. Stephen, how are you?
I'm sad. I'm a David stan. I am, a tribe of David.
Yeah.
And I'm bummed about today. I was really enjoying David on the season. I mean, I figured David was not going to win. I think David winning would have been like, I might have had complex feelings about it. But David being in the game, I had mostly positive feelings about it. A lot of people didn't, saw on Twitter this week, a lot of anti-David sentiment.
Yeah.
He certainly was talked down to some of the ladies. But in terms of like his force on the game, I liked seeing something a little bit different, like an actual alliance staying together. We've been saying for so long, why don't people stay together? Why don't we have an alliance? And he got, we only got to like the final 8. That's not that great. Or final 9.
Look, was David my favorite ever? No. But did he make you feel something?
Yeah,
absolutely.
That's what I wanted. Right. And I wasn't like endorsing everything about him. Like his final words. Sometimes we're heroes, sometimes we're villains. We're people. And I believe that. He's a person. I believe he's a person.
Yeah. And to anyone who's saying that David is not a person, maybe you're the problem.
Yeah. No, I like David a lot as a TV character. He added a lot of drama, a lot of conflict. He added some really funny moments. And ultimately, he was right. As I've said before, I think he was not. I mean, we'll get into like how he dealt with Joe, this episode. And I probably was more bullish on that. I feel like the episode was trying to tell us a story about how like David was driving everyone crazy, and maybe he was, and that's the kind of thing that like doesn't necessarily translate as much to television when someone's like really like running all over the beach. But like in terms of like the merits of the case, David was right. Eva and Joe were like objectively wrong to turn on him. Shauhin was wrong to turn on him.
Okay, good. Well, let's talk about this because I do think that there was a little bit of David gaslighting that went on in all of this, where that David was trying to say like, there's a problem here. There's something is wrong, and there was a lot of like, you're crazy. You're crazy. And then I think that might have made him more crazy.
Would happen to me. I mean, that did happen to me. It would happen to me. That did happen to me. You're like, this group is forming. This person is doing this, and everyone's like, oh no, we're buddies. We're buddies. And obviously, like you look at it from someone like Eva's perspective, and like she's like, I am buddies with them. Like they're not my problem. But like Eva and Joe were extremely protected by the existence of David. By this like strong 6 group. Fracturing is terrible for them. The other thing that go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I think there's a lot to say about it. I mean, Mary really gassed David up in the wrong direction. We'll talk about it all, I promise. But let me just set up a little bit of what's coming up. Of course, exit interview tomorrow with David. Looking forward to that one. And then we've got another great week of podcasts. Stephen, check this out. We've been on such a roll. We got another good one this week. Tiffany Irvin is going to join me on Thursday for the New School interview. And then the legend, Jerry Manthe, will join me on Monday, I believe, for that one. Really, all the old school interviews have been so much fun. And a great one with Kelly Wentworth the other night. So looking forward to catching up with Jerry about everything Survivor 48. And of course, you can hear all that and more in the We Know Survivor feed, WeKnowSurvivor.com. But you won't hear my patron Q&A when the people call in with me live at 3 p.m. Eastern. And that is only for the fine folks over at robhasawebsite.com/patron. All right. Stephen, so many different parts of this. Where did you want to start with the fall of David?
Well, first of all, I think we should get out of the way. Just the challenge itself, which is it's so amazing. Well, we don't really want to talk about the challenge that long, but that's why I get it out of the way. But like the challenge, it's like incredible, right? I mean, and it's happened so frequently on Survivor that like the day David goes out is because of this like blink in a challenge, right? Like if he had just like, Joe was almost done. His ball was done, and David was like, I mean, he obviously had
plenty in the tank.
Yeah, he was fine, and there's like little hesitation. He trips. It's crazy how often that is the case in this game. Like your whole fate in the game is determined by like one blink. And if that doesn't happen, probably Mary gets voted out here, right? That's what it looked like was going to happen. Maybe Mitch, but like Mary getting voted out would have been amazing for David. Suddenly David is no longer this as giant a threat as he was.
I didn't even think of that.
And so like, I think like if David does not get like, if he doesn't blink here, like I don't think David is winning, but I think he's going a little bit further than we saw.
Yeah, because Mary, I think definitely was like, I don't want to say the bad influence, but the influence on his shoulder of telling him of, it's like in one of these movies where, somebody is like, hey, you should be the star. Why
it's
is
Grima Wormtongue. Yeah, Mary Wormtongue.
Yeah.
No? Anyone?
She's in it. I don't know the reference. I'll be honest.
A Lord of the Rings, he's like in the ear of Theoden King, telling him all the things, the bad things.
Yeah. But David's listening to her and he's like, yeah, you're right. I gotta do something about this. And so, without her, it might be a totally different story for him. But this was like Survivor poetry when we get the scenario like this, where here's Joe like hanging on by a thread, and then David with plenty of gas in the tank. A lot of arm challenges in this season.
yeah. It's the right season for the right team
for David.
For the Strong Six. But also like, and we got a little bit of hubris from David here, right? Like, oh, he's like nodding, like, I got this, you're out. He's kind of like gesturing, oh, Joe, I'm going to take you on reward.
I'll take you on the reward. Yeah.
A little bit of hubris. And that probably was, as it often is, his tragic undoing, because he probably just kind of like lost focus on where he was because he was just like anticipating Joe finally dropping.
Yeah. Do you think any part of this was akin to in Tocantins when Tyson, who's dominating the challenges, has one challenge, he doesn't win, where it's like, okay, well, maybe we weren't going to vote for David tonight, but now he didn't win immunity. So like, is this our one chance to get him?
Yeah. And especially with a performance like that one, where like it really looked like he should have won. I do think there probably was that aspect of it of, we got to get him now. Like, who knows? Like, this guy very well could go on an immunity run. And I'm sure there's a little bit from Joe, right? Like, there has to be some ego of, without, if this guy's not here, I'm like the strong guy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Were you surprised that Joe did not take him on the reward?
No, because Joe's choices all made sense. Obviously he's taking Mitch because like Mitch hasn't eaten. And I do think like the politics of who hasn't eaten loom very large for the contestants on the beach. And especially if you're a man of honor and integrity.
Had you been aware that Mitch hadn't eaten?
No, but like, I'm sure they are. I'm sure like, I'm sure Mitch has reminded them as he did, but people talk about that relentlessly, who's eaten when. Then who was the second one he picked? Shauhin. It was Shauhin and Eva were the other two. So, those are his folks. I mean, is it like the best strategic move to leave all the people from the other group, on the beach for it's all Siva and Mary, who's like David's, buddy. That's probably not the greatest choice, but I get it. I mean,
should David have known the writing was on the wall when he didn't get picked for the reward?
I don't think so. I think that's, people over-index on that.
Okay. All right. Which aspect of this do you want to start with? Because there's so many different players and looking at it from their different perspectives. Who do you want to start with?
I think the one to start with here is Joe, because he's obviously the sort of like hinge vote here. He claims like it's Eva's choice. Maybe it's Eva. Maybe we start with Eva actually, because it's like Joe goes with Eva. I mean, there's more meat to like the Joe discussion, I think. But maybe I'll start with Joe and then we'll go into Eva.
Yeah, start with Joe because he's in this interesting position where he is a very different player than we are used to seeing on Survivor, especially in the new era, where that there's such a quietness to Joe. But he really, in that quiet demeanor, there's a lot of power, and it's a little bit like, and you see this in some of these Big Brother seasons where it's like one person is just running the house, and then these other little factions keep like playing like this tattletale game and going up to like, hey, do you know this person's doing this? Do you know this person's doing this? And then really it comes down to who does the king favor ultimately?
Yeah. And Jeremy was very much like that person on my seat on Cambodia, where like literally like he was talking to everybody. Everyone would go off and ask Jeremy for his opinion. And I mean, you know, I remember Abby called him the Big Apple, which was you know,
yes, famously.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's funny because on a different season, I don't know if Joe gets well, obviously, but like he doesn't have that role, you know. And I think David like sets up Joe having that role because Joe is sort of this like old school honor, integrity. I'm going to stand by my word. On a different season, like the game like zooms by him. I mean, Kamilla made that point of, you know, if there were like weirder people here, I'd fit in better, but it's all these like big macho people. This is what I'm stuck with, you know. And I think that kind of vibe favors like Joe, and the fact that there's someone more extreme than him. You know, he's the less extreme version of that in this season.
Well, the big conversation that we saw in this episode between Joe and David, and this was such a great moment where David is like pleading with Joe to make the case about, you have to see there's stuff going on. It's Kyle, it's Shauhin, it's Kamilla. You have to see it. And he says to Joe, you know, we have to play the game right now. And he goes back to the last tribal council, and David says that Joe went back on his word.
And that's it. Joe just like shuts down.
He was wounded in that moment. And David might have been done right there.
And I agree with you. I think like that for Joe was so like went so deeply against his personal code. Like obviously this is the story Joe tells himself. I am someone who sticks to my word. I do not go back on my word. And I don't mean that in a bad way. We all tell ourselves stories
of that.
Yeah.
Not but everyone tells do that. I'm not capable of it.
Right. And like that is part of his identity. Like, and so and I actually like, again, like I'm obviously very like I'm probably relatively pro David to the average, you know, person who's in our orbit. But I didn't think I think the story that will be told or the talking point around that conversation is that David botched it. I actually think he did not botch. I mean, after that, saying that was obviously bad. Maybe he should have retreated faster. You know, he's like, but I didn't think he handled it so badly. Like he was like, first of all, he's like, well, you know, can you see it from my perspective? You know, where there's this and this and this happening. And Joe's like, no, I do not go back on my word. And maybe at that point, when he saw how ferocious Joe was about it, he should have been like, listen, I'm absolutely wrong. You know, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to. But he did back off of it. You know, he says to Joe afterwards, like, well, you know, maybe I misspoke. You know, I maybe I'm wrong about that, and I misspoke. And you know, I see that now. Like, you know, he kind of like he does back away from it by the end, which is what you would advise someone to do in that situation.
No, but it wasn't a complete reversal.
It wasn't a complete reversal.
He said, you know, I still think it was my way. You know, he really stepped on a landmine with that. And he may have been, and tell me if you think this was the case. You know, I've just been watching Heroes versus Villains over on the Patreon feed, and with Boston Rob and Coach, when Boston Rob is feeling like after Tyson goes home, that he feels like that he can get Coach to sort of like, hey, Coach, remember you said you know you gave your word, and Boston Rob tells us in confessional, he's like, I know, Coach, that he has to be for like a man of his word, and that's like basically Rob has sort of figured out that he feels like he sort of like hacked the code of okay, Coach like this will be too much cognitive dissonance for Coach to not do what he told me he's going to do. Ultimately, he votes for Courtney at that tribal council, and that's sort of like his off ramp there.
He's a little man.
Do you think that was David feeling like does he know this about Joe? And when by saying like, hey, you know, I felt like you went back on your word at that, does he feel like that's going to be the thing where Joe's going to have the wake up call like, oh my God, you know, that's not who I am. I can't go back.
That's
on
a really
word.
good point. He was trying to say that as a way of kind of like pushing Joe to see his point of view, and it backfired tremendously because then Joe feels like, you know, Joe can't handle the cognitive dissonance of that. You know, and obviously Joe ends up going back on his word when he votes out David. But you know,
I was kind of waiting when David gets voted out. When Joe said to David, "Hey, I'm not capable of doing that," I was kind of looking for David after he got voted out to say, "You're not capable, Joe."
I mean, he gave him a look. I felt like the look said, "You're not capable, Joe." You know, I feel like that was the look, and Joe just like looked right back. It was a very powerful look. But it was, and you know, someone, I was talking about this because this scene was released early, and I was talking about it on Twitter, and someone in my mentions said, and I thought this was an astute point, that like maybe for Joe, like part of the psychology here is he knows that he is going to have to go against David, and so like he's almost like playing it up more, you know, like he's like, I'm like, oh, I'm really mad about this. You've really crossed the line here, you know, because he knows that at some point he's going to have to vote out David or go against David. And so like, this is a way that he can kind of help justify that to himself.
Yeah. Now, does Joe know he's doing that? Is that sort of like that?
I think the point is no. I think you're like, that's where you're like fooling yourself. You know, you kind of like, I mean, I don't know. I mean, like my read on it is just like, this is like Joe's code, but I thought it was an interesting observation.
I think it's so interesting that not just in this particular moment, just speaks to like the nature of these shows that we follow, where that people have these really strong beliefs and that each person has their own little bugaboos that you might accidentally trip up, and you have to understand what's the right way to, you know, position yourself with each of these people. Like, it's so fascinating. And this conversation I thought was just such a beautiful illustration of what's great about Survivor.
Yes, exactly. Like, it's like objectively, it's this like strategic game, and like you all have a, you know, an optimal move, not really, but like, you know, but then it's people, and it is real life. You know, it's real life. It's actually happening. It's part of their lives. Everything we do is real life. So like it's you know, people's moral codes and people's like identities come so strongly into that. And, you know, we see less of that these days, I think, than we used to. I think it used to be such a core part of the show in a way that was really compelling television. And it's like, that's like another thing I like about this, you know, Strong Six and we're moral. I mean, it's like, it's not my code, but it's fun to see people operate according to a code and like try to have a code that's different than just like, let's get out the most, you know, the tallest poppy right now.
So for Joe, he's ultimately the one who greenlights this decision to take out David. Do you feel like that this was a big mistake for Joe?
Unquestionably. I mean, like, again, like I still think Joe may go on to win the season. And I think to your point, he's in that spot of everyone kind of deferring to him as the sort of central guy. And I think he's still insulated enough. You know, I think people like Kyle and Shauhin and obviously Eva are still like committed enough to him that nobody is really going to go for him. And I think, but like, just like from this perspective of having this insulation of this group, I think Joe is, you know, in a worse spot for David to be gone. I mean, David was explicitly saying he wanted to go to the final three with Joe. Like, you know, you want people in the game who A, are not going to lie to you, and B, want to take you to the final three. Like, that's, you know, and see who you can beat, you know, who the jury is mad at. Like, David is a great person to be in the game for Joe. But we should talk about, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, I just want to agree. I think this was a mistake for Joe. I think that for Joe, that he really had things set up perfectly, where you had that in his group of 5 or 6, like people were sniping at each other. David wanted to go after Kyle or Shauhin, or, you know, come up with plans to go after other people. Kyle was never looking at Joe. David was never looking at Joe. Nobody was coming for Joe or for Eva. And then to go down to the end, that he had basically like final 3s and 4s, so many different ways across the board. Now he ultimately cuts off a big way that he could have gone with the Mary and David scenario. And then, not to like look too much into the previews, but it seems like the people on the bottom are going to like start to have like a little bit of an uprising here coming up next week. And he's painted himself into a position where his numbers of potentially is now him, Eva, Shauhin, who's like now hanging on by a thread, and he's got a hope. I think he thinks Kyle is with him, but it's not great.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Shauhin, because, we got this like really fun montage of Shauhin like laying the groundwork to eliminate David. I thought that was a very fun scene. Shauhin's like, I've been doing this for days. And then you have him talking just for days of these little clips of like putting this bug in people's ear. Oh, I think David's paranoid. I think David's this. I think David's that. And I mean, that is how you get someone voted out of Survivor, right? You just sort of like put out all these little feelers and let people come to the conclusions themselves. That is a brilliant way to get someone voted out of Survivor. For Shauhin, it is a terrible result because he's basing this, and he doesn't know this, right? He's basing this on a huge misapprehension, which is that he and Kamilla have this like great secret thing. But in fact, Kamilla is actively targeting him, actively trying to get himself eliminated from the game, or to get him eliminated from the game. So like Shauhin goes from being at this center of this group of people who were protecting him, right? I mean, even last vote, like he looked like he was the other target potentially. And the start of this episode is him being somewhat rattled by having his name come up. To now, that protection is gone, and he is probably still a really big target for all of these people who want him gone, including Kamilla, who he thinks is his ally.
I don't know necessarily, because now Kyle and Shauhin have had this working relationship together, and so maybe that Kyle was feeling kind of down on Shauhin, and that maybe that this created some new road together for them to be able to travel down. So I don't know necessarily what the future holds, but I kind of feel like that there's only room for Kyle or Shauhin to succeed in these next couple episodes.
Yeah, I think this is going to be bad for Shauhin. I think Shauhin is probably, in the crosshairs of a lot of these people. For some reason, I mean, it's funny, like he makes this remark about like, why am I like the target of like, it's like the big muscles are being targeted and suddenly like it's my name being written down. But yeah, it's like, I think that it seems like his name keeps on coming up again and again. And like, once you're in the crosshairs, it's hard to sort of like remove yourself from that.
Can I stop down for a quick edit question for you?
Oh, I love an edit question.
Would you say that it is probably not great for the winner prospects of Shauhin in that we are seeing what he did in a montage as opposed to watching it in the real time?
Oh, I don't know. I actually think that is great. Like, I feel like the more editing, like effort that is around you, like that's typically what's considered like, like the more editing, like manipulation that is like around you as a character is typically considered like good for your, your chances.
And I ask because you are a more careful observer of this than I am.
Like manipulation in an edit is like typically considered like the sign of a winner's edit, as opposed to stuff coming up naturally within like the scope of an episode. So for him to get a whole montage of like, look at me pulling the strings is, but I think I made the same case for Teeny last season, and I don't know, how did that work out? Was that right? Was that
when Teeny's bag got burnt, you were very taken with that.
Yeah, but also there was some were like some like montages of Teeny doing strategy, and there was like one montage in particular where Teeny came in, I think at the last minute, and we saw a montage of them doing strategy, like talking to this person and this person and this person, and I was like, that was very exciting to me as like an editor reader. So like, what do I know?
We haven't gotten to Eva. That was the other part of making this decision with Joe. We saw her go off to go and get a new advantage this week, Stephen.
Yeah, which is like a great scene, very fun scene. I'm excited to talk about this. So should we talk about Eva vis-a-vis David or Eva vis-a-vis the advantage?
Let's go with the advantage, and then let's talk about her David decision.
Yeah. So first of all, it was very fun because you never see someone actually get clocked on these nighttime excursions. And in fact, on Twitter, someone was saying, I don't remember, someone was saying that like nobody ever gets clocked on these nighttime excursions. And then of course she does by Shauhin following her, making a deal out of it. That was a fun moment. She goes.
Yeah, he goes and wakes up Joe. Joe.
Yeah.
He's like, look, it's Eva. I don't care.
Exactly. She's fine. Very fun. I mean, anything with torches is fun. I love the transition from like the night vision footage to like the color footage. I thought that was really cool. It is a little broken. I mean, we didn't really talk about this last week because I think we were kind of like, we had our episode. We had we taped before we actually like kind of, it came out that it looked like this was an advantage that was going to the challenge winner. And so like, maybe we should talk about that because we never really got a chance to discuss that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about it.
But like, let's talk about the advantage itself first. So first, Eva gets like an immediate extra vote, kind of a nothing advantage, right? But then she can risk that for a 50% chance of a safety without power. Do you do that, Rob?
Yeah, I think so, because I feel like the safety without power is kind of like an idol if you played it the right way, where, you feel like, okay, things are getting a little spicy here. I'm going to basically bounce out of here.
Yeah, I agree. I would definitely risk it for the 50% chance of the safety without power. Now, would you risk that for a 1/3 chance of an idol?
I think not.
That to me seems insane. To your point, a safety without power is basically like functionally an idol. Like you don't get to vote, but like you don't get voted out. Like why on earth would you like actually have like a slightly worse idol? Would you take a 30%, 33% chance of like, of nothing of a slightly better thing? It's terrible.
Yeah. Okay.
It should have been like a steal vote or something.
That I was making a crazy decision to not go for the idol.
Oh no, I think like even the fact that it was a decision is crazy. Mm-hmm. Like who's going for that? That's a terrible choice.
Should have been 2/3.
Yeah, 2/3, maybe 2/3, and then there's still like a little bit of a 1/3 chance of an idol when you have essentially like mini idol. No, bad.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well put. Okay. Yeah. So she comes back with it. She says last week, "I'm not. This is just for me. I'm not telling anybody about my advantage."
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. And then ultimately, she comes back and tells everybody. Do you think that Joe potentially said to her, like, "Hey, you got clocked. You better tell everybody about the thing"?
I actually had that thought that like someone maybe kind of like just gave her a nudge and say, "You got to come clean about this so that people aren't suspicious of you."
Okay, well, we don't see it in the episode, so
for
all intents and purposes, it didn't happen. And then we got Eva has to make a decision about should we vote out David, and she didn't like it that David, from her opinion, was really stirring the pot.
Wait, what? Can I make one point about the safety, about the advantage?
Please.
As she read it, this was the text, by the way. I thought this was very funny. And I texted you when this came out. Congratulations, you now have power in the game. This advantage offers you safety without power. It's just perfect. It's perfect. How do you improve on that?
Yeah. Maybe power is safety without power.
Yeah. Congratulations, you now have power in this unsafe game. This advantage offers you safety without power. Very funny. Anyway, okay, back to the David decision.
Yeah. So Eva feels like that David is really stirring the pot. Eva wants very much to be a part of this team. They're going to do something that hasn't been done before. They're going to prove that you can play this game a different way.
Yeah. How did that work out?
I mean, why do we need to try to prove this? Like, we already proved you can't do this.
But they could do it. That's the thing. They could have done it. Could they have done it?
No, because you have to lie to other people, or they're gonna go, or they wouldn't get there.
Did you make the Tobias joke? Someone I feel like would think that like he's like maybe for us, maybe this time it'll work.
Yeah, I mean, Kelly Wigglesworth tried to prove this.
Yeah,
in 2000. We don't need to keep trying to prove this.
Has nobody proved it? Surely someone must have. But there's been a lot of alliances that made their way.
Here's the thing that what you can do, and this may well be how Joe can win the game. You can make it look like you're doing this, but for all intents and purposes, you are not making it to the end of this game and winning without lying and deceiving.
But what about there have been a lot. That's true, but there's been certainly groups of 5 and 6 who have gotten to the end just by hanging tight with each other. I mean, that for years was like the strategy of Survivor.
Who cares? And then what happens? Are they all like lovey-dovey at the end? No, then they're all mad that you lied to me.
Those people really hate each other.
They really hate each other.
Yeah.
Like, whoa, wow. Like, you proved that five people can vote together.
Yeah. But like, I kind of was excited to see if they could prove that. Yeah.
You didn't even prove that.
Yeah. But like, it would be fun. I thought it'd be fun to see an old school alliance, actually endure in this day and age. But there is always someone on the bottom. And fortunately, in this case, it was the people on the top who flipped, which doesn't usually happen.
Yeah. So let's talk about Eva's decision.
Yeah. So she says, like, I feel comfortable with everybody, but they don't feel comfortable with each other, which actually great. Again, like, you're on the top.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Eva trusts Joe. Joe trusts Eva, and they have to ultimately make a decision on what to do here. Why do they make this decision?
Yeah, I mean, I think Joe. We know why Joe makes the decision, right? I get the sense that Eva just doesn't like all of the paranoia and the scrambling, and she attributes that to David specifically, rather than all of the just like the general fact of Survivor at the final 9.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that's often the case where when people will get voted out because like they will become sort of the sacrificial goat of like, this person is why there's chaos on this beach. We would all be existing in harmony if it weren't for this person. You know, it's such a common narrative. Not the case, but
yeah.
Yeah.
But I think you're onto something. I think that probably from Eva's perspective and maybe from Joe, it's like, boy, you know, David was the cause of all the disharmony yesterday because he wanted to get out Kamilla. And now today he's all worked up. And now Kyle and Shauhin are saying that they want to get rid of David. Like maybe if David wasn't here, not to mention he said, I went back on my word.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what we need to do.
Yeah, I do think there is a lot of that. But again, David was right. He correctly clocked the Kyle-Kamilla relationship and the Shauhin-Kamilla relationship. You know, in that point of like, why can't we get votes on this person? It's like a clock tower thing. You know, like in Blood on the Clock Tower, you know, when you're like, why can't we get votes on this character? Like maybe that person is the demon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, let's bring the Kyle and Kamilla angle into this. I thought that Kamilla was really MIA in this episode.
Yeah, she had a few very funny confessionals, but not a lot of actual.
But what's she working on? Like, what's she doing? Like, I think she's such a good player.
Yeah.
Like, we're not seeing her. Why not?
But
what's
to
she
her
up to?
point is she doesn't have the social relationships this game. And it is such a function of just bad luck, right? Like if she had been on the last season, she would be like, she'd be like right in her group, you know, she'd be like swimming in that pool. But now it's like the vibe is totally other than her. And so it's like, she's a little bit outside of the decision makers. And I do think those people end up having to, you know, last season, it was Sam and Genevieve who were on the outs while, you know, you kind of had like the strategists like in the mix together. And this time it's like the strong people while the, you know, the strategists are kind of cast out a little bit.
Okay. We really got to see a lot from Kyle's perspective in this episode, that we see him where that's the morning and the Strong Six is together for their morning sunrise sitting on the beach. And David is still at it. They're talking about who they got to get rid of, that we got to get rid of Kamilla. And so Kyle feels like his relationship with David is not so great. So he goes to work and he brings in Shauhin to try to get another person to vote out Mary here.
Yeah, I thought this was very clever the way Kyle did it, because he made it about Shauhin, right? He made it about, oh, David's worried about your and Camilla's relationship. Like he's casting this big target on Kamilla to weaken you. And then suddenly it becomes personal for Shauhin in a way that we saw, right? He said, like, this is about me. You know, like that's what every survivor thinks. This is about me. And so I thought that was very well done from Kyle.
Okay. So David and Kyle continue to talk, but that David is still pretty hot with Kyle.
Yeah. I mean, I think that gets to sort of where David does go wrong here, is just he's, you know, he can't calm himself down. I mean, I love that scene at the beginning where he's like, you know, I'm gonna backseat drive this one. I'm not gonna, you know, and then like he's like, but it should be Kamilla. It should be Kamilla, you know, like he can't like hold himself back. And I think that's why we see him, you know, talking aggressively to a lot of people, is like he gets so passionate that he just can't restrain himself, even when he knows he can. So I do think like that's where David Bloomberg here, you know, hat tip. That's why David lost. He just like couldn't like, you know, slow play it.
Yeah. You know, David is such a contrast to a couple of the different players in the game, you know, where, you know, Joe is just like, he's quiet. Like it seems like I feel like that he's intense, but he's quiet.
Yeah.
That David is not that. Yeah. Kyle and Shauhin are two players that are very much like, okay, we are going to work under the radar and sort of like go about things quietly to try to make things happen. Again, David, that's not who David is. In the end, the David way of playing the game, I feel like that it is not a successful one.
Yeah. You do sort of have to be willing to sort of, and he knew, you know, like in that scene, he was like, I've been pushing too hard. You guys you figure it out. But then he can't stop himself from pushing. And then you see it later on, right? Where he like comes up and goes, well, why are we still mad about each other That's all water under the bridge. And yet he can't stop himself from pushing.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Mary in this. I mean, you mentioned her a little bit too, because I just thought that scene at the very start was so funny when Mary is saying like, you guys are more than shields. Like, you meet shields, you deserve better from this world. You know, she really has like stepped into this role of kind of like, I mean, you know, Chief Wormtongue. You know, that's my go-to here.
Yeah. Yeah, she's really hyping up the Strong Six. She seems to be fully integrated into the Strong Six now at this point.
Does this blow back on Mary? Do you think Mary is the next one to go?
No. I mean, it seems like that Mary is now maybe with Kamilla next week, maybe with Mitch, maybe with Star. And all of a sudden, there's all these people that are sort of like on the outside of this thing. And if Kyle or Shauhin is willing to go and flip, this could be trouble.
Yeah. I mean, Mary is really functioning very well as a chameleon. You know, the fact that she was able to say, you know, when she was first on Bula, oh, yes, I'm with you. You know, Say and I have put our differences behind us. Now it's all about us together. You know, and then here she jumps over and like becomes like BFFs with David, and is suddenly like, you know, oh, you know, they're after the four of us. They're coming to get us, guys. You know, and then hopefully we see her jump to the next group. I mean, she's being really effective in this sort of difficult role that she's got, where she doesn't necessarily have a natural alliance.
Yeah, I think that she's going to be somebody who's very interesting to watch next week, because I think she's going to really feel especially burned by Joe and Eva after this.
Yeah, I agree.
And she could be maybe the person putting together the alliance of people on the bottom.
Yeah, I mean, that would be really fun to see. I would like to see some of the top people hoist by their own petard for betraying David. You know, that's what they would deserve.
Yeah.
And I kind of think that might happen to Shauhin.
Perhaps maybe with Joe winning immunity and Eva having so many advantages that maybe Shauhin is the soft target that they end up going for, especially if Kyle ends up flipping with Kamilla.
Yeah, and he was also wasn't he who did Star throw out him, or did Star throw out David? Star threw out Shauhin, right?
Star
on the reward, she kind of comes up and is like, "What about this?" And everyone's like, "No, we can't do that."
Let me go back.
No, I think it was. I think she threw out Shauhin, because then everyone was like, "No, we think that there might be an idol there."
Mm-hmm.
And then she's like, "Okay, whatever."
Yeah. So Star says, vote out Shauhin to David and Mary, and David's like, "I can't do that."
Yeah. So I feel like he's the name that everybody kind of sees as this, you know, big target figure in a way that, like, again, it's like the Jeremy thing. Like, vote out Jeremy. You should vote out Jeremy. Don't vote me out. Vote out Jeremy.
Well, I think everybody's scared to hit Joe or Eva, but they feel like, okay, well, here's Shauhin sitting right there.
Yeah, exactly. And he's got less protection.
But I'd love to talk just about Kyle for a little bit, because Kyle had a lot to do in this episode. We see Kyle, we talked about him trying to work with Shauhin to get things going, but we saw a real attempt to bond with Joe. And I think that Kyle, while David was sort of like milk brothers with Joe, I feel like that Kyle fundamentally understands Joe more than Kyle does.
More than David.
I'm sorry, Kyle understands Joe more than David does.
Yeah. I agree. And I think that was really like, he gets that, like, yeah, exactly. Like tapping into this sort of like personal, you know, here's why I'm acting the way I am. Like, this is personal, you know, this goes back to my personal roots. You know, I hope it, you know, and then be really respectful. You know, I hope it isn't like, you know, bothering you basically. I thought was a great way to interact with Joe too. I thought that was really a good point.
Yeah. Personal bond with Joe from opening up. Not to say that like Kyle is like completely calculating in this scenario, but that really seems to be the way to, you know, touch Joe's heart if you want to win him over as an ally, as opposed to what we saw David try to do with really just come in and sort of like bulldoze over like, hey, you have to do this, where that just by naturally opening up, you know, if David would have had his story about like living in the trailer for Joe, maybe at the end of that, Joe's like, I'll follow this guy anywhere. Whatever
you're right. I think that's a really good point. You're absolutely right. I mean, and so much of Survivor is that. It's like knowing how to interact with the people who you're around. Like, they're not chess pieces. You don't just like tell them the move. You have to kind of connect with them where they are. And Ethan Zahn said that to me before I went back to Cambodia. It's like, you got to be like the brother for the person who wants a brother, like the son for the person who misses their son, and like, I didn't do that. I failed, but like, it's really good. It's really good advice.
That is good advice.
Yeah.
And we see that Kyle ends up winning over Joe. And then after that, Joe opens up to Kyle and tells him about David.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so it was great for Kyle. I mean, I think Kyle probably, this was his episode. He was a little bit on the back foot last episode, and he was negotiating this question of, how do I navigate this like big six that is controlling the game, and strong six, and like my own alliance with Kamilla, where that's where I feel like my real connection is. And he does it by getting rid of David. And I think he is probably in the best spot right now of anybody, I would say.
Okay. Couple players on the bottom, Stephen, that I want to make sure we get a chance to talk through. Mitch caught a lot of flack last week. Why did he vote with the vote against Chrissy? But here he is. He's on a reward. He's voting with the majority.
Yeah, I mean,
here comes Mitch.
Yeah, I mean, Mitch said, like, my hands have been tied because, I haven't been outside of this group, but like now, and he's the one who kind of brings up, let's get David, right? And everyone's like, what? Wow, we didn't even think about that possibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He brings it up on the reward, and he says, David is the one person that I'd really like to get. And so, Mitch, everybody likes him. And so I think they're open to that idea, especially after he doesn't win immunity. Have we given Kamilla enough attention? I feel like that she did not have a big episode this week, but I feel like she looms large going into the next episode.
Yeah, I mean, she's got these wonderful relationships. We certainly see. Well, I guess not. I don't know why I said that. That's not really true, right? She doesn't. That was her whole. That was like, even Kyle said that. I've got all these social bonds, and she's the strategic powerhouse. But she's a strategic powerhouse. It was fun. I mean, she's such a great character. I love her confessionals when we get them.
Yeah, and she was going to miss David, having him as a target for her roasts in the confessional.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And Star is somebody who
it's like
she's
Couture
on the
after
wrong.
Bruce was out. It's like, what is Couture even doing anymore? I guess you get Jake sort of as a foil after that point.
All right, Star, she is on the wrong side of the vote, but does not seem to be in any danger coming out of this. I guess that she was on the swap tribe with David and Mary, so she feels close enough to go and tell them about the idea to vote out Shauhin. At the tribal council, I thought that she has an interesting moment with Kamilla, where Kamilla talks about how David, that he's losing jury votes, or that basically, if that's how you want to play, you're not going to get me as the jury vote. And Star laughs, and Jeff asks her about what's going on. And Star, just in her own way, she's able to sort of, kind of damn Kamilla in terms of like that she thinks it's so funny about how Kamilla is such a straight shooter.
Yeah. Was that damning Kamilla?
Like, I don't know if it was necessarily damning, but it was able to, and I really, to me, like, I see somebody do this and I'm like so dazzled by it, because she can kind of like have a laugh that doesn't come across as mean-spirited, and is able to highlight, what Kamilla is doing in a way where Star, it's not just coming across as like a likable aside from Star.
She's delightful. Every time she speaks, I'm in. Like, I wish I got more Star in my episodes. Like, she might be like my favorite character right now. We see the least of her. I think. I mean, not like, obviously we don't see her playing the game and she's not distracted, but just in terms of like how much like fun I have when I'm watching her on my screen. Like, I think like she might be my number one. And such a wonderful sequence where she's pushing herself to swim. I thought like just everything she said about it was beautiful, like how wonderful it'd be to be so free out there, like, swimming so at ease. And then you see her pushing herself to do it. And I thought she was great. She was like, looked really like decent at swimming, I mean, like, she really was like doing a good job. And it was so cool to see her pushing herself and striving to grow. And her confessional about it was hilarious, and like this time, next time Jeff calls me, I'm going to be ready. I just thought like,
get her out there, season 50.
I would love that. I would be very happy with that. But yeah, and she was, and that remark at tribal, I thought was very funny. I wish Jeff did more of that at Tribal. Like I feel, first of all, I think Tribal's a lot better. I think Jeff has like dialed back the metaphors quite a bit, where he doesn't like, not everything is like Survivor is like a balloon, it goes up and up and up until it pops. But like, wow. But I think there's less of that. But I feel like when I was on Survivor and Tocantins, Jeff would really get into the specifics of like people and their relationships. And now it seems like very top level. Like Shauhin says, people are making emotional connections. And Jeff's like, okay, like someone else talk about that. What's an emotional connection? I feel like Tocantins era Jeff would have been like, okay, who was making the emotional connections? Like who is bonding? How does that affect you? Really getting into the actual personal dynamics. Star says, I'm trying to figure out who can I flip to my side. I think Tocantins era Jeff says, who are you going to? Who do you think is likely to flip? That's like what's interesting to me as a viewer. And I think that like I really wish I could see more of that. And maybe he thinks he's like making it easier for the contestants, like he doesn't want to like out anybody's game, but like surely that's his job here, right? It's like push on people. And if they can avoid him, like good for them. But if they can't, that's their fault.
Yeah, it's a good question. And there's so many other parts of the game where that he's trying to make it harder. And we got players, they have to earn everything. They can't just be resting on their laurels. They got to fight for everything. So I can't imagine that he's trying to make Tribal Council easier.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it's because like if they get into something, then suddenly they have to like have footage for it in the episode. And that's annoying, like if maybe it's like if he asks, Shauhin.
But he doesn't know what footage they've shot.
Well, no, I know. But like, why get into something that's going to make like the edit harder, leading up to that point? If like suddenly Shauhin starts talking about, the deep relationship between Mitch and Star, we're like, do we have that? But I don't know. Like I missed that part of just the show, where he really digs into who is, wearing whose boots.
I wonder maybe if it's a little bit though that he kind of knows, okay, the story is, okay, David is at the center of everything. And is Joe gonna basically keep him?
Right. So we don't need to like redo it.
Like if what's going on with Star and who's talking to Star, maybe he's just like, okay, well that's not really what's going on right now.
Yeah. I don't know, the point of like Shauhin saying like people are making emotional connections. Like who's making emotional connections? But again, or maybe he's asking those follow-ups and it's not making the edit.
Yeah. All right. Stephen, are you ready to dole out the most coveted award in podcasting?
It's the most coveted intro theme in podcasting.
It's time to award the Fishy. Called by some a broken award that rewards losers for losing. Not anymore, baby.
Yeah. So let's talk about the options.
Thank you, Eric Barger, for the Fishy intro.
Yeah.
Shortened by popular demand.
But like it's still there by popular demand too.
Yes. Yes.
All right, let me present to you some options, okay? And for me, the favorite is Kyle this episode. Last episode, like I said, Kyle was and even at the start of this episode, we saw that Kyle was in a very tough spot. He's got his relationship with the Strong Six, and he's also got this relationship with Kamilla. David is getting wind of that, and he's trying to tell everybody, watch out for Kyle, watch out for Kamilla. This pair, they're going to flip on us at some point. Instead, what Kyle does is he gets to the whole rest of his alliance to flip on David. He gets, he goes to Shauhin and he makes it personal for him. He says, you're being targeted because of your relationship with Kamilla. He builds that bond with Joe. And ultimately, I do think he's one of the prime movers of why David gets voted out here. Because so to me, and I think Kyle probably benefits the most, other than Kamilla, from David getting voted out here, where he still has those bonds with the other people in the Strong Six, but he also gets to keep, Kamilla there too. And he probably loses the least because David was kind of getting very suspicious of him. I think I've got to mention Shauhin too, because I think that as a possible candidate, because we do see that sort of montage of like him kind of like laying the groundwork for David to be voted out. And, from his perspective, he has a relationship with Kamilla. Even from our perspective, Kamilla is actively targeting him. And it's probably somewhere in between, right? He probably has a relationship with Kamilla that she maybe is, when there was a smaller tribe, she was targeting him, but now she's like, it's never like one thing or the other. I think he's less of a good candidate because I think that he probably gets hurt the most by not having like the strong six really, really defending him. Let's see who else are good candidates. I mean, really, those are the ones.
That's it. I think it's between Kyle and Shauhin this week, and I think it really comes down to that the move to take out David was a first step, but who's willing to take out Joe or Eva next? I don't think that Shauhin is ready to do that, and I think that there's going to be a numbers crunch coming up, where unless we're going to go back to the drawing board and it's like, okay, let's stick to the plan. Let's vote out Mitch next. Let's vote out Mary. And then let's get it down to like 6. But I feel like that if Kyle is going to make the flip to Kamilla, then who else is going to come with them? I don't know necessarily, unless, I feel like Kyle and Shauhin are like fighting for the same pawns on the chessboard. I guess the question is, who's going to get them? And I feel like that Kyle has a little bit of a head start because he firmly has Kamilla. So it's going to come down to who has Mary, who has Star, who has Mitch out of those 3. I don't have a great answer for that, but I just feel like that in terms of picking up the pieces that are at the bottom, I think Kyle has a little bit of a lead over Shauhin.
And I actually think that he's even in a better spot than you're saying, because I think that I don't see it as being like one, this side or this side. Is he like with this group or that group? I feel like the way survivor votes work, everyone comes together and they target someone. And I think Kyle has enough protection, whereas that kind of onion gets sort of like eaten away, he's not going to be the one anybody's voting for, right? Nobody, like Mitch isn't coming for Kyle next, and if he is, then you've got, now it's Camilla's turn to protect Kyle in the same way that Kyle has been protecting Kamilla. Whereas I don't think, but Kyle also is protected by Joe and Eva. So I think that, Kyle kind of has protection from the votes coming from either side. Whereas I think Shauhin probably only has protection now from Joe and Eva. And, even that, like, how strong is that group anymore now that like the chief cheerleader has been voted out?
Where if Kamilla next week can do her work and get to, Mitch and Star and also Mary. Now, Mary was very anti-Kamilla during the David phase of the game, but we'll see if Mary can flip things around. But if Kamilla could sort of round those people up and like, hey, guys, I think we can get Kyle also. Like, what? You can get Kyle? I think that there's a possibility to get 5 people together there. I'm not sure that Shauhin can put that together because that at best, Kamilla, I don't think is going to go along unless that Shauhin wants to vote out Joe or Eva. Like, he's not going to be able to get that group together to vote out Kyle.
Yeah. And honestly, like probably Kyle and Kamilla now have the most, most power in the game, the most room to maneuver of anybody, because they do still have that Siva bond with Mitch. They have the strong bond with Joe, Shauhin, and Camilla's got the bond with Shauhin too, and Eva. We've seen who was I mean that's pretty much it. I mean, I don't know where Mary falls into all this.
I would say they have the best position in the game, but I still think that Joe and Eva still have the most power because
that's a good distinction. Yeah.
With David out of the picture, if Joe wins immunity at any point, it's like basically Eva has an idol and safety without power. If Joe is immune, then basically like you can't touch that duo. And so that if anytime Joe and also Eva could potentially protect both of them if she ever wanted to.
Yeah.
So it's going to be very hard to take the shot at those two.
Yeah, that's a really good point. But so ultimately, I think Fishy for Kyle, this was a great episode for him. He did great strategic work. He did great interpersonal work. He saved his best ally. He got out the person who was coming for his best ally while also getting his other allies to agree to it. I mean, that's really hard. He took out someone who is a part of this core alliance while getting basically the entire rest of the alliance except Mary, basically the rest of the alliance to agree to it.
Okay. All All right, Steven, anything else on your mind from episode 9er?
Well, just to say, the great conversation at Chat BCC continues, where it's very fun over there, especially during the episodes. I would highly recommend someone, you log in. It's super fun. A really great, community is building there, and come join us.
RobertsWebsite.com/VIP chat if you want to join us there over on Chat BCC. Of course, I mentioned earlier that we are going to be live with the patrons on 3 p.m. coming up on Friday. So be on the lookout for that. We have a brand new perk for our patrons there as well, where you can listen to all of my U.S. Survivor deep dive interviews as a new perk over on Patreon. There's a playlist, about 80 some odd post-game interviews, including the two-parter I did with Stephen Fishbach after Survivor Cambodia.
Wow. Sounds good.
Speaking of Survivor Cambodia, then check out Kelly Wentworth, who joined me on Monday night. Had some fun conversations with Kelly. Have you seen any of the videos that Kelly does where she impersonates Jeff?
Of course. I love those videos.
Yeah. Fun stuff there with Kelly Wentworth.
I didn't know she was such a goof. I mean, I knew she was like, creative and clever and funny, but she's such a goof. I love it.
Yeah,
I had no idea.
She makes a lot of great content, so check out what Kelly is doing and check out my conversation with her over on the Patreon feed. We did a feed drop this week talking about Parvati playing not one, but 2 idols this past week, as Steven somehow, sadly, 15 years ago, JT got voted out of Survivor Heroes versus Villains.
Wow. Sad day for America.
Was it the best move ever in Survivor history? Josh and I will discuss over on the Patreon feed, but you can see it for free preview in the RHAP main feed. Also, over on Robin and Kiva Need a Podcast, Robin and Kiva rated your fridge. People called in live. We rated refrigerators live on the show. Fun episode of RHAP. And then check out Battle Camp. I believe Chappelle and Kirsten McInnes are talking about the new Netflix original series, Battle Camp. You have any knowledge of that, Stephen?
No. Tell me about Battle Camp.
I have no idea what it is. It looks like it's like Netflix Field Day to me.
Yeah.
Everyone
looks very happy
shows,
in the promo image. They're all smiling.
Yeah. So they're doing stuff.
Looks like they're having fun.
They're at some kind of a camp. So check that out
Probably
over on Netflix. All right. Stephen, anything else for you? Chat BCC?
Yeah. StephenFishbach.com, Twitter.com, X.com, Stephen Fishbach.
All right, there you go.
That's where I am.
And then Thursday, big day. I will have David on the exit interview and Tiffany Nicole Irvin and plus Club Condo coming up. And then my interview with Jerry Manthey. That's all here in the podcast feed. Make sure you subscribe. I love to read your comments on Thursday about what you had to say about the know-it-alls. Take care, everybody. Have a good one. Bye.
Bye.
This is RHAP. We know reality TV.